Strand. For a little bit of history, Strand was founded in 1927 by Ben Bass over on what was then 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until after over 92 years, Strand is the sole survivor still housing new and used books. Tonight I'm thrilled to be hearing all about billion-dollar fantasy from its author, Albert Chen. Delving into the story of how FanDuel and DraftKings went from startups to explosive, unavoidable giants to them being hounded by the feds, it's a high-flying yet intimate story of greed and redemption. Albert draws therein on his experience covering sports and the business surrounding them as a senior editor at Sports Illustrated, as well as writing for Fortune, appearing on CNN and NPR, and many more. Joining him to discuss it is Ben Reiter, also a senior writer for Sports Illustrated, where he's written 25 cover stories. Ben is the author of Astro Ball, his account of how one of those covers predictions came true, that the Astros in 2014, one of the worst baseball teams in history, went on to win the World Series in 2017. The tale of the managers, analysts, and players who upended decades of strategy and received wisdom and made it the Baseball Book of the Year and a New York Times bestseller. I'm thrilled to have these brilliant writers here tonight to discuss one of this century's biggest and most defining stories in sports. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ben and Albert to the Strand.
Well, thanks so much for that wonderful introduction, and what a great night here tonight. This iconic bookstore, my friend and colleague for 15 years now, Albert Chen next to me. So many friendly faces stretching way back there. I hope you guys can hear us. If you can't, let us know. To talk about his fun, insidery, fascinating account of $1 billion startup war. Now, I'm not just saying that because he's my editor at Sports Illustrated. It really is. In fact, I'm going to embarrass him by reading some of the early reviews. The Library Journal has called this book energetic and engaging. The Wall Street Journal, an hour ago, published its review in which it praised the vividness and repertorial precision of billion-dollar fantasy. Publishers Weekly, in a starred review, said, in this entertaining debut, Sports Illustrated editor Chen examines a decade of online fantasy sports in which players compete for cash prizes by assembling rosters of professional sports players. Fans of financial thrillers such as Barbarians at the Gate will be excited by this insider account of the dizzying rise of fantasy sports website. It was an Apple Best Book of the Month for this month. And on Amazon, I just looked this up actually, it's #1 book in sports gambling, #1 book in sports industry, and it's #2 in fantasy sports behind an actual Quidditch set. Brooms and stuff. So that's pretty good though, because that's Harry Potter.
Yeah,
So he's
I'll
#2
take that.
behind Harry Potter. That's good for an author.
I was actually offered the Harry Potter spin-off, but I decided, you know what, daily fantasy sports, that's more marketable.
So I think what we're going to do tonight is, I have a few questions that I've been dying to ask Albert, and then we will open it up to the very many of you out there. I'm sure some of you will have some questions for him as well. And then Albert's going to sign a whole lot of books that you all are going to buy tonight. So it's going to be an excellent night. To start it off, I mean, for those of us who are not degenerate gamblers, and I only actually see a couple of those in the back that I know of.
There are a few of them.
What is daily fantasy sports?
Well, good question.
I prepared.
It is it's a variation of fantasy sports where it's funny because someone actually brought it up where, oh, you wrote a book about daily fantasy sports, you know, interesting. But what I actually noticed having read the book is that you don't really actually explain what daily fantasy sports is. And that was part of the challenge, and what I wanted to get at was, because I think a lot of people here would probably agree that the line, "let me talk about my daily fantasy sports team," is a terrible way to start a dinner party conversation.
Nobody wants to hear about your fantasy.
And it's not a great way probably to start a book reading, but daily fantasy, you know, what I ultimately wanted to do was tell a story about the startups behind these two companies, which started out very kind of obscurely in completely unexpected places, particularly Scotland, University of Edinburgh, where they were the FanDuel founders were not sports fans, certainly not fantasy sports players, and wanted to tell the story about this larger thing that started as something very, very small, daily fantasy sports, and turned into something really massive in 2015.
So daily fantasy sports for the uninitiated is, the idea of the companies is you essentially each day set a lineup based on real players, and at the end of that night you compete against, after having competed against a pool of hundreds of other players, if your lineup has performed the best, you win actual money. That's like that's the enlivening idea.
That's the idea behind it, and why it was so different from traditional fantasy sports. We've been in these leagues. You and I are in a league where I think I'm in last. Actually.
You've been busy, but that's
it is. What was interesting was like these games were presented as fantasy sports games, when in actuality they were very, very different. This league that we're in, leagues that a lot of people probably here are in, it's all about the social aspect. People flying in for auctions, from at a sports bar and just getting together and finally catching up with your old high school friends. Daily fantasy was something entirely different, and it was all about the money. I mean, I went to Colorado 3 times and spent time with daily fantasy players, hardcore daily fantasy players out there, to try to understand what it actually was. And I essentially did not leave the house for 3 days. And this guy was in front of his computer, and it could not really, in some ways, be more polar opposite from the season-long variety that we're used to.
Okay, so by 2015, this thing has turned from a few guys in their basements in Colorado into kind of an inescapable phenomenon, really. I mean, Trevor Noah on The Daily Show, and I'm not going to do his very pleasing South African accent, but he says, these days it feels like you can't turn on the TV without seeing one of 3 things: a zombie, a Kardashian, or a fantasy football ad. I think everybody probably remembers that fall when they were just entirely inescapable. John Oliver, on his show, called these fantasy games the most addictive thing you can do on your phone, except maybe cocaine. So these things were pretty big by 2015. But what was not clear was where they were going, right? Like what was going to happen with these games. We're kind of right in the middle of it. And you're not a gambler. You're not much of a gambler, at least I don't think. But this whole book...
You have no idea.
Maybe you're a secret gambler, especially now. But this whole book was really a gamble. Because most of us like to write stories or books after the events that we're writing about have actually occurred. But you kind of pitched this book, agreed to write this book, came up with the idea midstream, or mid-tsunami, as you put it in the book. You had no idea where this industry was going. You had no idea by the time when you wrote the book what would have happened, if the industry would have even existed anymore. Can you take us into that process? And it must have been stressful.
Yeah, man, I'm just stressed. So I remember kind of the moment where I talked to my agent for the book. I just did an interview with, it was just really random, but Baker Mayfield actually in Norman, Oklahoma, did an interview with him and stepped outside and got a call, and the scandal was sort of happening. And by this time FanDuel and DraftKings had been shut down in New York, and it was just snowballed into something where we had no idea where it was going. And I'd written a story at SI for Sports Illustrated in 2014, sort of at the beginning of all of this, and then watched this where they were raising hundreds of millions of dollars, and you got the commercials and then the scandal. And so the book agent's like, this sounds like a good idea. We have no idea what the ending is. You've never written a book before. I've actually, and it's Scott Waxman, we both know him, and he's worked with a lot of Sports Illustrated writers, and he was like, I've never I've never had a project before where a first-time writer it has dove into a story with so much uncertainty. And I was like, that sounds like a great way to spend the next 3 years. So yeah, I mean, we went into it having no idea where this was going, in some ways entering the story at the very beginning. But the way I sort of approached it was, that actually wasn't the most interesting part of the story, because there really wasn't much of a scandal, and there was a lot of, 2015 was very interesting for very, very, very different reasons. And it was all about the people. And I think what ultimately, what I set out to do was write a book that hopefully people who have never played fantasy sports, don't care about gambling, can pick up and actually feel very invested in the characters. And luckily, what I found out was that, the characters behind the story were really, really interesting.
I actually want to ask about those characters, because as you say, there's not all that much about, Dak Prescott and Odell Beckham and, various athletes on whom people are betting. It's really about the people behind the scenes who are creating these companies that would have skyrocketing valuations out of scratch, who are from scratch, I should say, who in many cases were risking jail time, risking the ire of the authorities to realize this dream. So I wanted to ask how you went about kind of gaining their trust, because there's a wide variety of founders in this book. One company is found by, traditional brash American type, but the rival, FanDuel, is found by Scottish people at the University of Edinburgh who can't name a single NFL player sometimes if you quiz them on it. So how did you go about kind of meeting this wide variety of characters, earning their trust, and convincing them to go along with your vision, which didn't, as we say, even have an obvious conclusion yet?
Well, ultimately the story is actually about 3 companies. Draft Street was started just a few blocks from here. FanDuel's current headquarters are also not too far from here, and DraftKings was founded in Boston, and their main offices are up there. And it was a lot of traveling. I went to Edinburgh, went to Boston, went to a lot of live events, and for these essentially parties that these 2 companies threw. And so at the end of the day, I knew sort of what book that I didn't want to write before really eventually figuring out what this book was. And there are a lot of people, I think, who would cover this industry much more on a sort of daily basis. And I didn't want to sort of go the legal route and try to explain the history of fantasy sports through this book and through these 2 companies. So it all had to be about the people, and at the end of the day, these 5 founders from Scotland, I think on the surface, for sure, it's interesting. It's the classic sort of story of the outsiders coming in and totally upending the system. And it just took a lot of time to really kind of get their trust, and the trust of, whether it was Jason Robbins at DraftKings. I still don't know if I have his trust or not, but I certainly had a lot of conversations with him, and getting to the story at Draft Street for the kind of the original origin story right there.
So what is the relationship between scrapbooking and daily fantasy sports?
Scrapbooking, and clearly not a lot of people have read the books. So. The connection to scrapbooking to daily fantasy sports is one of the main characters of the story, and that's Leslie Eccles, who was the first chief marketing officer and later the executive vice president of marketing for FanDuel. And for me, it was all about finding these characters that are totally unexpected. And look, I mean, a mother of 3 in Scotland who's creating ultimately these ads that are appearing, as Trevor Noah put it, all the time. Every 90 seconds, on our TV screens during the heart of NFL season 2015. And she was very, very competitive. And in fact, to maybe liven up this reading, I will read a scene from a scrapbooking club in Edinburgh, because that is actually it's a key moment in this book.
Let's hear it.
So this is the third chapter in the book, and we're essentially beginning to be introduced to the characters at FanDuel. We sort of get the origin story of Draft Street and the initial history of fantasy sports, leading into this story in Scotland that is just kind of a little bit odd and unexpected. It was Leslie's friend Lucy who invited her to the weekly scrapbooking club, which gathered at a home tucked away on a winding tree-lined cobblestone street. A small group of women arrived clutching boxes of old photographs and craft supplies, desserts and bottles of wine, seeking a night away from their breathless city lives. This will be good for her, Lucy thought, because if anyone could use a little more wine in her life, it was Leslie. In the group, Leslie was always the odd duck. For starters, among lawyers, teachers, and stay-at-home moms, she had a job that no one quite understood, other than that she was an entrepreneur. As women cut and pasted photographs and other keepsakes into albums, while Leslie talked about this new company that she and her husband had started, something to do with online games in America, the others in the group did their best to avoid staring at her as if she was a circus carny. What exactly was this thing called fantasy sports, and how on earth did someone like Leslie get roped into it? Soon after Leslie joined, the group's leader suggested an activity that she thought could add some spice to the nights. A little competition in which all of the members would have 30 minutes to create a page inspired by a theme: vacations, holidays, Disney characters, and so on. They would vote on a winner, and the winner would receive a spanking new scrapbooking supplies. When the competition started, the others chatted on about kids and the latest new restaurants and the books they were reading, but Leslie put her head down and went to work. If they looked over at her, they would have seen someone intensely focused on the task at hand, but they couldn't possibly know just how much winning meant to Leslie. They couldn't know that Leslie's free craft supplies were in fact a meaningful reward, given that she had 3 little ones and her family at home had been in such bad financial state in the early years of the company that she hoarded coupons and shopped at secondhand stores and was too afraid to even glance at the monthly bank statements, so that she could avoid the reality of their lives. After pouring through all their savings into this hopeless startup of theirs, she and Nigel, her husband, were flat broke. For Leslie, there was another motivation. The competitions were a chance to prove that she belonged in this group, to show that she was a worthy member of this club who in fact was just as skilled as the others in the art of scrapbooking. And after weeks of honing her craft, maybe now even better than any of them. And so when time was up, Leslie's albums were always the most complete. The odd duck in the group won the weekly competitions just about every time. Then one day, the leader of the club reached out in an email to tell Leslie and Lucy that the club would no longer be meeting. No explanation was given. A few weeks later, Lucy received a phone call from one of the members of the group, the leader, telling her that the group had actually started meeting again. But there was a catch if Lucy wanted to rejoin. At the behest of the others, Lucy couldn't bring along any other acquaintances this time, and she certainly couldn't bring along Leslie. When Leslie was back home on Wednesday nights and back on the living room couch with her laptop, working as fast as she possibly could on her endless list of responsibilities, Nigel was disappointed for her. For the first time, she had found an outlet from her new job. But he also knew more than anyone else that whoever got into a winner-take-all game with Leslie sooner or later found out what exactly they were up against. He knew that Leslie was always going to do everything in her power to win, and it didn't matter whether it was a weekly scrapbooking competition or a race to be a billion-dollar company.
So I love that section because it shows how somebody who, from Edinburgh in Scotland, who knows nothing about football, nothing about baseball, might have this competitive drive to become the unlikely leader and really the driver of many of those ad buys that we saw so often over the past several years of a potential billion-dollar company.
Yeah, and I think that that's kind of the crux of the story is, you know, whether it's these guys from Scotland or these three founders in Boston, it was all about outsiders who really looked at this industry that was completely rigid and lacking innovation for decades and decades. I mean, we're kind of drafting our team really in the way that many people have for decades and decades, and really taking advantage of, you know, this moment in, you know, whether it is technology or the capital markets, and being able to raise just an insane amount of money to create a product that was actually perfect for right now.
It is perfect for right now, but one thing that I found very interesting in the book is the product seems kind of flawed in a lot of ways, right? For something that became so popular, McKinsey did a study of these companies at Albert Sites and found that 90% of its prize money was won by 1.3% of the people who played the games. So they're advertising this scenario in which, hey, like, try your luck, throw in a lineup, maybe you could win $1 million. Like, it's not going to happen because you're playing against essentially like basement hedge funds who are running analytics on these lineups, who are playing hundreds of lineups a given time with slight variations to try to maximize their winning, and they did it very successfully. So what do you think, kind of given that, and given where we are now especially, what do you think the broader implication of this story is, and what does it mean for the future?
Well, I think part of this story is definitely, I mean, this almost ethos in Silicon Valley, or as you're raising money, of, okay, you're going to tell this large story about what your idea, what this thing could be. And you look at 60 million fantasy players in America, and that is a massive, massive market. Well, daily fantasy games right now is, you know, has sort of stagnated from the standpoint of, you know, 2015, we're talking about the height of it, you know, users are flooding into the market, and I mean, these companies are totally exploding, but DFS games really never sort of reached that level of reality that these companies were presenting to the investors. And really what it was this larger play at potentially, okay, here we are in this moment in 2019 where, you know, you and I can cross the George Washington Bridge and, you know, take out our phones and put money down on the New York Mets. Now, I don't know why you would actually want to do that, but, you know, it was sort of like this larger story of things are changing at a rapid pace, and we know this is a very, very big thing. Lots of fantasy players, people are looking for new ways to consume sports. So let's think about how, if we create a great product, acquire a lot of users, how we can sort of evolve to the next thing.
So is your theory almost that the daily fantasy component and this kind of endless nonsense argument that ended up being a crux of the legal case, is it a game of chance or is it a game of skill? Is your thinking that was all kind of like a Trojan horse for people who really wanted to tap into the larger sports gambling market, if that actually was legalized as it was for states to decide in the May of 2018 Supreme Court?
Well, I don't think this was certainly a part of a grander plan. I mean, if you look at sort of the pitches to, you know, the decks going out to investors, I mean, it was all about sort of survival, you know, bringing in the poker players to create this product that is really, you know, great. I mean, it's something different, and you know, it's something that I think a lot of people were certainly looking for in terms of just like that instant gratification. I mean, you and I are in this league where, man, it seemed like 4 years ago where we drafted those teams, especially my team, which is in last place. But it's this is you know, it wasn't quite exactly what the next step in the evolution maybe should have been, but it certainly was in that it tapped into something that was a little bit, certainly catered to really, what you and I now want in 2019, which is, shorter duration and more instant gratification. So, but it wasn't really part of this master plan where they thought that in 2019 or 2018, there would be this very significant Supreme Court decision that would essentially pave the way for sports betting going forward.
So the moral of the story, as usual, is just never gamble, right? Like, it's a bad idea.
If you're thinking about putting a DFS lineup, loaded with Astros, I think that's a very bad idea.
Well, great. I think we're going to open it up. I'm sure there's dozens of questions out there for Albert. I think we have a mic here. So raise your hand. Oh, sorry.
Raise your hand, we'll try to bring you mic.
Yes, Greg Kelly, another member of our fantasy league, behind me in this chair.
You alluded to a scandal. What was the scandal exactly?
So the New York Times in October of 2015. So I should say before that. I mean, really, the story becomes just interesting because these two companies are raising just hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, and every 90 seconds you see these ads, and they're just in the public consciousness, and people are beginning to ask questions of why are these two daily fantasy companies that really seem like gambling companies, why are they so prevalent? Why are they so, in our faces? So October 2015, New York Times comes out with a story alleging that an employee at DraftKings won $350,000 playing on FanDuel. And, so the initial headline is, using insider trading. And so it just becomes this massive story where, employees at FanDuel and DraftKings were playing daily fantasy games, and they were making a lot of money. In fact, in some cases, making more money on daily fantasy games than they were at their companies. And so that was a real problem. But the story was more about this specific instance where this guy was looking at, ownership percentages, and it was just kind of a convoluted sort of, hard for people to understand really why he might have an advantage. And he would have had an advantage. There was an independent investigation that looked into this, and he was cleared. He's actually still working at DraftKings right now. But that tapped into this idea that employees were playing these games, which just is, in retrospect, kind of insane, just a terrible idea. And it gets to this larger idea that these two companies, when it's 8 to 10 employees and you're, employee number 9 is playing these games, and seeing sort of how it actually works and how he's doing on DraftKings, may not seem like such a bad idea. But things happen so quickly that was an example of something where, there was someone at FanDuel who said, yeah, I had no idea, the high-ranking executive saying, I had no idea how many employees actually played. And it was just kind of stunning. So that was the initial scandal that was splash over headlines. Once he was cleared, quickly it pivoted into something very different and something that was actually even more damaging to the companies. And it was very simply a question of whether these companies were gambling companies. And so you have attorneys general from Eric Schneiderman to Kamala Harris in California looking into the legality of these businesses. And they were shut down in New York, they were shut down in a number of states. And part of the book is about how, these two companies that are very, very well positioned right now in 2019, there were many points where the CEOs would wake up in the morning and wonder if they would go bust that day.
Any other questions?
Two related questions. who was the person you were most surprised and happy to get to talk to you and you didn't think would? And is there anyone you most regret not being able to convince to talk to you?
There probably isn't anyone that I regret not talking to. I mean, there were too many stories to really tell in this book. In fact, very end at the process, I mean, there were players in Colorado that I'd spent a lot of time with, and actually the most successful daily fantasy players ever. And they had incredible stories, but I mean, it was a 150,000 word book, and no one wants to read that book. I certainly don't want to read it right now, and it exists on my laptop. And you know, the problem was really that there were too many stories to tell. And the danger in terms of identifying certain characters is that you give them too much weight and just sort of overshadow some of the other people who are very influential. So I focused primarily on the two co-founders at FanDuel, Nigel Eccles and Leslie Eccles, and that was the focus of my story at FanDuel. And you know, the first time that I met Leslie in 2014, I knew that there just had to be an interesting story there. I mean, look, she's at that point, you know, head of executive vice president of marketing at FanDuel, and she is not a fantasy player. She's not a sports fan, and she's the mastermind behind what in 2014 was just a brilliant marketing campaign where you're getting people to play this game that is legally questionable, and also, you know, I mean, it's fun, but it's something different, but people don't really quite understand. And she was able to really tap into that. So to get their stories, I think was big for, you know, I talk about sort of not having any idea where this book was going and really wishing that it was going to be anchored in these characters, and those two characters were definitely at the top of the list.
Can I ask about your writing process? Sorry, I have another one. Can I ask about your writing process? Because I didn't realize you'd actually written 150,000 words. So I guess you chopped down, what was this, about 90 or something like that?
It's about 9. I mean, it's a terrible 150,000 words.
Well, even so, it's 150,000 words, which takes a lot of typing. But how did you manage to do that? Because, look, I mean, you're full-time senior editor at Sports Illustrated, you know, whipping people like
you,
like me to shame as far as our stories. You know, you're the father of Leo and the husband of Andrea, who are out there somewhere. Oh, there he is. So that's time consuming. So like, what is your writing? Well, also pleasurable, you know, wonderful and everything as well. But what is your writing? How did you write 150,000 words? Like, when were you doing this?
Well, there's a reason why I couldn't edit the Alex Bregman story. No, I mean, it was finding time here. I mean, it was weekends, and if you really want to know, it was weekends, and I mean, I have no idea. Andrea could probably tell you better than me. I mean, it was weekends, taking vacations, and I mean, a lot of the writing actually was towards the end of the process because I had no idea what the story was. And
would you like hole up somewhere? Or would you like?
I mean, I can name all the different devices that I was actually writing on. You know, we have 2 iPads, writing on both iPads, my phone on the subway. I mean, it's just finding time. I mean, really to me, what was the challenge was the reporting, and you know, the vast majority of these interviews were actually done in person, and finding just, you know, a key chapter happens in a scrapbooking club in Edinburgh. A key late chapter happens in an airstream in the redwood forest, and that was 3 days in this RV, and it was with Corey Albertson, who was, you know, one of the players who was one of the main characters of the book. And so the process was very much, you know, getting as much sort of quality time in terms of sitting down with these primary sources and just, you know, talking to them. And the other part of it was the number of people who, you know, from both companies who, you know, whether left the companies or still are at the companies, who are willing to be very open and honest and talking on background. I mean, it's very hyper-focused, this book, on 5 or 6 characters, but it's really informed by a lot of people at both companies who really sort of were able to speak honestly about what went down. And quite frankly, a lot of those employees are kind of going through PTSD because it was an extremely traumatic time in 2015 and 2016.
A couple more questions out there for Albert. Yes, in the back. You may wait for the mic.
I know you talked about the $750 million in ads that were purchased in this conflict. Was that just agreed upon buy, or was that all actually paid out? I just want to know, there were instances where some companies that went under actually.
Yeah, no, there are still deals that both companies are locked into that, are still, at that point, you have to understand what is so kind of incredible about that particular moment where it added up to, $750 million by the end of 2015 was just, they're at a point where they essentially are still fighting for survival. They don't know. From FanDuel's standpoint, Leslie, who we've talked about, it's essentially her and her team. It's a big team at FanDuel in terms of making these plays. They are trying to game out in that moment in early 2015 whether or not this makes any sense in their reality. And so, just to give you an example, DraftKings signed a $250 million exclusive deal with ESPN at that point during 2015, which they actually got off the hook because of their legal problems, and ESPN pretty much let them off the hook, and it worked out very well for them. But the part of the story, these numbers are just astronomical. But what it was at the end of the day were these two groups and these people making these decisions, in Leslie's case, in Harry Potter world, whether or not to strike a $20 million deal for a radio buy that, certainly does not make a ton of sense, maybe in the grand scheme of things. But if you are them in that situation and it's kill or be killed, which is really a central narrative of the story, then I think if you're in their shoes, I think it's a deal that you gotta make.
One last question.
Maybe one more question from the crowd? No? No?
What did you imagine the book was going to be about? Because you said there were so many different stories and it was so long. What did you think it was going to be about when you started this? And how far away was that from what you actually ended up with in your final version?
There was a point, very early on, where it seemed very possible, in fact, likely, that these two companies were not going to survive. I remember going into one of the offices of one of the companies and talking to someone, and the person was like, "You realize that the ending of the book is that we're done." And great, that seems fine. That seems very conclusive, certainly. The other scenario was, it's no exaggeration. The executives at the companies, really wondered, certainly, whether they were potentially going to end up in jail. Certainly a lot of employees had sort of that level of fear. So the outcomes were, very wide-ranging. In terms of, what I was hoping for, I wasn't really hoping for anything necessarily other than really sort of something that is conclusive for the people that I'm writing about. And in the case of FanDuel, there is, none of the 5 co-founders are still there. So there was sort of the ending to their story, which is the ending of the book and sort of linked to this big Supreme Court decision in 2018 that really signifies the beginning of a new chapter for both companies.
thank all of you for questions. Ben, thank you so much for leading things along, and Albert, it's time to go up.
He makes it sound easy. He's like, oh, I wrote it on our iPads or like on the subway, I guess. But it's really not easy. This is an incredible accomplishment by Albert. Hope you guys all pick up a copy. In fact, he's going to be signing them right here. If you have one, you can buy it and line up. I'm going to cut the line and have him sign mine first, so I don't have to wait. But thanks everybody so much for coming. And Albert, thanks for asking me to do this. Real quick.